Yo, my name is Mubarak, and this is En Masse.
What is the content of these ideas that people are putting forward? How do we think through them critically, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, this person said that. Let's just do this thing." Quote that. Let's just do this thing. Quote.
So, welcome to episode 1 of En Masse. Given that this is the first episode of this show/podcast, I think it's probably appropriate that I tell you who I am and what this entire thing is about. My name is Mubarak, but some people know me by my stage name, MA, since I'm also a hip-hop artist. I was born and live in a place that most people call Canada, which is a settler colonial state, but I prefer to call it Turtle Island. And I usually never call myself Canadian, but just consider myself to be African or Black. Politically speaking, I refer to myself as a Maoist, and I'm a supporter of the Revolutionary Communist Party of Canada, known as the PCR-RCP. More particularly, I adhere to Marxism-Leninism-Maoism ideologically, and this episode will kind of go into details and explain what that actually means. My goal with this podcast basically is to interpret global and local events through a revolutionary communist perspective or lens, and emphasize the importance of revolution for workers and basically oppressed people all over the world if we want to see actual fundamental change. To give a bit more of my background, my parents immigrated to Turtle Island from Ghana at some point in the late 80s. I grew up mostly with a single parent, which was my mother and 4 other sisters. So that's my background, and it's a very working class background, which has obviously shaped some of my political leanings, which is the case for a lot of people that, consider this strain of politics. Enough about that anyways, and I'm sure I'll reveal more about myself as more episodes get produced. So for now, let's get into the good stuff. So for this episode, we'll be going in depth with author J. Moufawad-Paul, who is also a professor in philosophy and supporter of revolutionary communism. He also goes by JMP. He writes a ton about Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, which is also known as MLM. To begin, I simply asked him to explain what it is he writes and why.
I mainly write on things that have to do with communism and understanding the necessity of communism and overthrowing capitalism, and trying to think through a lot of the philosophical problematics that are associated with that now after the so-called end of history, which is when the Eastern Bloc collapsed and we were told that communism was worthless and all the Cold War ideology had reached a certain level that now, especially in the centers of global capitalism, it's seen by some people, especially the old guard, that communism has nothing to offer. And I'm talking about how it has had a lot to offer and still does for people, for the majority of the world, and how it's coming back even here at the centers of capitalism as being a very vital ideological movement. And mainly I've been kind of exploring what types of communist ideology are the most philosophically salient, and that's what led me to Maoism, or Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, which Continuity and Rupture was about.
So basically what he's saying is that he considers MLM theory, or Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, to be the most correct application of revolutionary socialism or communism. For the layperson, these isms probably don't mean much, but there are many isms involved in political or economic theory, such as liberalism, libertarianism, Keynesianism, and of course Marxism. With that said, Maoism, which is an extension of Marxism-Leninism, is considered to be a more developed version of Mao Zedong thought, or MZT for short. It developed around the 60s in opposition to what was the revisionism of the Soviet Union. Revisionism being when so-called Marxists and communists actually deviate entirely from revolutionary thinking and Marxism, which in turn directs things towards a more liberal or capitalist way of thinking and acting, instead of a more revolutionary socialistic way of thinking and acting. So I asked JMP what the significance is in making a distinction between Mao Zedong thought and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism.
Describing this to the regular person outside is the first place you start, with the regular person outside that doesn't, normally I just talk about revolutionary communism and what it means, and I think Maoism is the best example of that. I mean, really, I would just like to use the term communism or revolutionary communism to really put forth that revolution is essential to it. But there are so many types of Marxisms that come out of that
Yeah.
trajectory, or even non-Marxisms that claim the name communism, that when we start talking about it theoretically, the way we start talking about it is you have to start loading it up theoretically in this way or that way. And Maoism has a very specific formation. So when I write, I talk about that's what, communism is. And when you talk with people, that's the kind of communism I talk to them about it without necessarily saying, hey, this is Maoism, guys.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Which, is not going to mean anything to someone that hasn't heard the terms before.
Good point.
But, I mean, if your question is what is Maoism for the layperson that understands Marxism and generally has an understanding, and that audience that those kinds of books are aimed at, then I would say Maoism is kind of, well, we talk about it like its historical emergence versus its kind of theoretical meaning. You pointed out how I make a distinction between Mao Zedong thought and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, and that distinction for me is very important. And Mao Zedong thought, which was kind of the Maoism of yesteryear, is the kind of the people that were using the term Maoism in the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s. That just meant a kind of Marxism-Leninism that was following China against kind of the Soviet Union, because there was that Sino-Soviet split.
Anti-revisionist movement,
Yeah, the anti-revisionist movement, like going back, rejecting Soviet revisionism. And I mean by that, the idea that under Khrushchev, there was this kind of period where they said we can have a peaceful coexistence with capitalism. And the anti-revisionist movement, sided with China and was like, no, let's go back to this revolution. We can't have any kind of peaceful coexistence or class collaboration. And so that was like mainly Mao Zedong thought. It just kind of aligned with the Chinese Revolution, Mao being the principal theoretician. At the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, you had a bunch of groups putting forward this claim that Maoism represented a third stage in revolutionary science, like Marxism, Leninism, and then Maoism. And they said this because they claimed that Maoism had certain features, theoretical features, that were won through the revolution of China and understood much later, that were universalizable. And that meant that they could be applied anywhere in the world in particular circumstances. If you want to have a revolution, you have these features are important because we learned from the failures of the past, and the successes of these features are important. So Maoism brought to Marxism and Leninism a number of things. One of them was the importance of the mass line, that you couldn't have this commandist top-down party, that like the party had to have this kind of notion where it was held in check by the masses. And that you would do a lot of social investigation, figuring things out with the masses, and it kind of concretized that theory. Another one was, I guess the most important one was the theory of cultural revolution. And that's the idea that in socialism was understood by this Maoist theory as still being a class society, that you would still have to have a class struggle under socialism if you wanted to ever keep socialism going, let alone create a classless society. And that if you failed at this, then capitalism could be reasserted. So the claim was that the masses, in this sense, and this connects it to the mass line, should be unleashed on the party, because sometimes a new bourgeoisie or bourgeois people that are committed to a bourgeois ideology will appear within the party itself and need to be held in check. And the other one, but this one's still controversial within the Maoist forces, but one that I think that a lot of the Revolutionary International Movement, which was the group of all these Maoist organizations around the world that decided Maoism was the third stage, they talked about the universality of protracted people's war as opposed to the theory of insurrection. And I don't know if we want to get down that line of what protracted people's war is, and that's still debatable within the Maoist camp. But that's another one that was claimed to be universalizable. So it's the idea of seeing it as not just anything Mao Zedong said, but in the same way that Leninism, that there's these new kind of conceptions that break from some of the claims of Leninism, but still uphold a revolutionary continuity with Marxism and Leninism.
Definitely. I think that what he says here is crucial, because Mao Zedong thought and the anti-revisionist movement of the 60s and 70s was a sort of premature version of Maoism given its historical context. Mao Zedong thought, although correct in its rejection of revisionism, was still trapped within the confines of Marxism-Leninism and couldn't fully sift through and theorize a complete Maoism as of yet. I think that the name Mao Zedong thought is also very telling, because not everything Mao said or did was correct at all times. He was completely correct about the Soviet Union being revisionist, and this is proven by the fact that capitalism deepened itself over time until the USSR collapsed in the late 80s. I think that the mass line, cultural revolution, and protracted people's war theories are also crucial and important, but he also had what was called the Three Worlds theory, which was facilitated by the fact that He thought the USSR would be the next superpower and supersede the US. Because of that, he became revisionist towards the end of his life and began normalizing relations between China and the United States, which was entirely incorrect. This point also emphasizes what we'll talk about later in regards to rejecting dogmatism and people worship, which leads into my following question in regards to the limitations of Marxism-Leninism or ML theory.
Yeah, I think it was a historical process Khrushchev and his peaceful coexistence with capitalist thesis is, just isn't something that just came out of the blue. It followed kind of, if you follow like what Marxism and Leninism by itself was claiming at that time. You can see this all through the Stalin era and the inability to recognize that socialism, that class struggle continued under socialism. Now I know kind of like more doctrinaire Marxist-Leninists try to claim they can find this somewhere in the works of Stalin, that he says there is some kind of thing like a cultural revolution we need to have, or that there is. But at the same time, you can't really, it becomes down to this kind of like phrase hunting with kind of people that go back to Marx and try to find all these things that mean this aspect of Marxism is correct. And you can always find like contradictions. We can find one. And it's for me, it's not just finding that, it's like what practices did exist. So there was no theorization of class struggle under the Soviet Union in any sense, right, by Stalin or anything like that. It was this idea that capitalism could be reinstated, but the problem was always external. It was always people acting on behalf of imperialist agents, or even the remnants of the old bourgeoisie that were still agitating in society. Not people that could be socialists, that could unintentionally get drawn to a bourgeois ideology and want to reinstate the capitalist road. But Stalin had this notion of the party that was a very top-down and commandist. He referred to it as the, in this very military terminology, as I can't remember the actual term he used right now, but it was, it had one to do with this kind of military top-down language of what the party represented for the proletariat. It had this commandist notion that the party was this command-down thing to the proletariat. And, Maoism emerges out of the experience of the Chinese Revolution, where didn't concretize as a theory in that time, but all the processes were there, where the Chinese Revolution could see what were the limitations that were hitting the Soviet formation at that time. And a lot of what they were beginning to theorize, or under Mao, but a number of people too under Mao, were beginning to theorize was how do we struggle against these problems we see that are instituting themselves in the Soviet Union, and this is what the Cultural Revolution emerges in response to that.
The important thing to recognize here is that Mao and his supporters in the Chinese Communist Party considered themselves to be Marxist-Leninists, and in doing so in their particular context, they were able to correctly move the country towards socialism to a large extent. They saw the mistakes of the USSR and attempted to build upon that concretely. In doing so, they developed new ways of tackling the problems that arise when attempting to move towards socialism in a capitalist world. In turn, they were correct about many things, but also incorrect about certain things, like I had noted earlier. Lenin and the Bolsheviks also did the same thing in analyzing the particularities of Russia before and after the revolution. In doing so, they were correct about many things and were able to start forming the first socialist country in the whole history of the world. But new developments also created space for mistakes and incorrect ideas that were based on the material and concrete experiences of their time. Lenin didn't see himself or his party as Leninist, he saw himself as a Marxist. Until after they were successful about certain things, then Stalin and some other people were able to conceptualize Marxism-Leninism. In the same way Mao and his supporters in the CCP saw themselves as Marxist-Leninists and not Maoists, the theories couldn't have been completed until after certain successes were achieved. Because of that, I consider myself a Maoist and hope we can achieve a successful revolution that takes from the successes and mistakes of previous socialisms. This leads into my next question, which speaks on the theory referred to as the primacy of the productive forces. Semblances of this can be found in Marx, Engels, and Stalin. Basically, what it posits is that the development of technology or productive forces will, in a way, single-handedly open the path for social relations to change in society. This means that a socialist country should focus all or most of its energy and resources into technology, and this will somehow make social relations change eventually in the future, thus ending the capitalist versus worker relationship altogether. I think that's an incorrect idea. So I asked JMP about it to see his thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very large question to answer, right? Because I mean, there's different. I mean, I think we can't, reject the notion that Marx and Engels both pointed out the importance, and sometimes they would say the primacy of the productive forces, but they also, I mean, there was that one letter that Engels wrote about how sometimes we would overplay and say these were prime because we were trying to correct one mistake, and then other times we bring up the relations of production because we were trying to correct one mistake. It depended on who they were arguing with. Like, so for them, or at least in the tradition, both are very important, right? And should be seen as related and interrelation. I mean, I hesitate to use the word dialectical just because everyone uses it to hide talking about it further. But I mean, it is dialectical, but I'm not going to get into that. There was like this era that was theorized under the Chinese Revolution, where they talked about like the productive forces, which was kind of notion of economic determinism or technological determinism, and they saw it accruing, especially in the Soviet Union under Stalin at certain points, this idea that we just have to industrialize really fast, and once we build kind of the new productive forces, then the relations will follow. It wasn't always clear that Stalin was saying that all the time, and sometimes he said different, right? And I don't want to say that, but it is very clear that that is the path the Soviet Union took all the way up to Khrushchev, this idea of the productive forces. And it, of course, affected people in China, too. There was a number of groups in the Chinese Communist Party and a whole faction that was pushing that line as well, the importance to get experts and to build. And the reality is that it makes a lot of pragmatic sense. If you think about the Soviet Union after World War II, being completely devastated and needing to build up forces of production and technologies, and also trying to hope that they would be these new liberatory ones that would give people more time. And also in China, in this the same situation after World War II, a giant revolutionary war, the whole semi-feudal, semi-colonial thing of having to build a whole bunch of like technology, it can become very easy to fall into this economic deterministic way of doing things and just get it, and then everything will work out. But a lot of the argument that was made in the Chinese Revolution, especially around the theory of new democracy, was this notion that yes, we need these new productive forces, but they should be under the command of proletarian relations, right? And so that was always the line struggle in China, was about that, because they'd seen it happen with this, a bunch of experts ending up with like this kind of becoming a new bourgeoisie within the Soviet Party because they became the experts, whereas in the Chinese Revolution, with this focus on attempting to mobilize the masses, was trying to also like educate people to become both read and expert, so that the productive forces would be held under command of the relations of production in the two. It was much more of a struggle to do that, but it was an important struggle that they said. So yeah, I think it is important to know that we need new automative technologies in order to have socialism. It's the other error to suddenly say social relations matter. It's like someone that like thousands of years ago could institute modern socialism just through their own voluntaristic will. I mean, there are certain technologies we need to make food available for everybody, to have water, all these kinds of things, right? But the whole productive forces, the idea that this technology will just transform things without any kind of human potential, is it's connected to that revisionism. And it's also not just in Marxism-Leninism. Like, there's that new kind of a really popular kind of post-capitalist theory of accelerationism, where they claim this whole thing about we shouldn't have revolution anymore. These new technologies will just it's like almost like a train. It's on the track. You just got to make sure it goes really fast. Smashes down all the contradictions. So I mean, it's still an error outside of the Marxist-Leninist Maoist tradition.
For sure. And I've seen even because I know there's certain people, like for example Richard Wolff, who focus on, at the point of production, the workers having control in terms of like in the workplace and things of that nature. And sometimes I think people make this error of like basically saying all we need to do is like start a bunch of co-ops, across Canada or across whatever country, and somehow socialism will manifest itself out of that. So I don't know if you want to expand on that or.
Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting direction to take it, because I'm actually, one of the manuscripts I'm working on now, I've been working on for a number of years, but it's so messy that I keep going back to it and changing around, is on some of these issues. It's on economism generally, the interrelation between kind of forces of production stuff, workerism, this idea just to go into a trade unionism instead of a revolutionary consciousness, and how all these things are interrelated. So what you're bringing up is kind of, very related to the forces of production thing you mentioned earlier, this kind of workerism.
Yeah.
This idea that all we need to do is get these people like working at the point of production, and then almost like presto changeo, they'll have a proletarian consciousness, and they'll produce a new party formation and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it also kind of ignores like the way that there isn't, especially now, the way that capitalism is transformed, there's not one single point of production in one place, and there's like all these points, and there's also the circuits of capitalism that become very important in the way that finance has structured the world, and also that some of the most visceral and violent points of production aren't even in the centers of capitalism anymore. They're in the peripheries, especially when I think about like silicon manufacturing, which is one of the largest industries because it makes computers run, but it's also one of the worst mining industries with the most amount of people, and that's not even here, right? So like, what are we talking about, that point of production where you can't, like, what are they going to set up, like silicon co-ops or something? Like, so yeah, I think that like that kind of workerism is really connected to it, and we have to think. I think Maoism brings this to the table. You have to think about like what the proletarian means, and I don't really have the best answer to that fully. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on it, but we can't just think it's like people in unions in the first world working in factories, right? Because they're not even being they're organized by capital now, especially with the historic concession between labor and capital.
What I took away from this part of the interview was that there are many aspects when it comes to maintaining socialism. I think it's also important to point out that capitalism and socialism are growing and moving things. They aren't simply frozen or static entities. Socialism in particular attempts to move towards a stateless and classless society. Therefore, if a so-called socialist country moves towards ingraining capitalist relations, regardless of if the party in power calls itself communist or otherwise, then it becomes a capitalist state and no longer a socialist one. Back to my original point though, I think that there are many aspects to maintaining and running a socialist state. We can't simply focus on technology and how it develops while ignoring questions of social relations and workers' control. We have to think about both social relations and technology and how they impact one another. We also can't simply focus on the economy while ignoring culture and how it also has an intertwined relationship with economics. These are some of the major questions that arose out of China during Mao and his supporters' attempt to undo the mistakes of the USSR that they were seeing repeated in their own party at the time. So I asked JMP about this point.
Well, I think it's not really, we shouldn't say new problems that arose. I think it was the same problems. And I think the problem is that bringing in the Cultural Revolution in the way that it happened, I mean, the beginning of the theorization is important. Like it really understood what the problem was, but its solution to the problem at the time was kind of too little too late, right? I mean, it was almost like, okay, we've just theorized this problem, but there's massive amounts, there's like, entire factions of the Communist Party that like had, different views. And it wasn't like that because they were evil and conspirators, it's just because of the way that like the prevalence of bourgeois ideology and the desire of productive forces, what they learned from the Soviet Union. So there was a revolutionary upsurge in the Cultural Revolution. It was complete chaos, but it wasn't. Really, the capitalist roaders won. Right. That's what happened. Is the Cultural Revolution was lost because it was theorized too little, too late, and it didn't really understand the extent to the problems. I mean, a lot of that is us theorizing it afterwards. It's like, okay, what went wrong? What was that? Right. It was left to people outside of China. At the time, were like other revolutionary organizations throughout the world outside of China who were in the anti-revisionist camp were like a lot of them. I mean, there was a split in the anti-revisionist camp, but the ones that had the correct line were like, oh, the people underneath Deng Xiaoping are the capitalist roaders, and the capitalist roaders have won. Now, I mean, there were some bad theorizations of that. Like, I mean, this will probably get me termed a heretic in some circles, but I think the claim that it was just a coup on the part of Deng Xiaoping, and that there was the really good Gang of Four that were, scapegoated for everything, and that they were perfect
or something,
and there wasn't. I mean, that doesn't really seem like a class struggle story. It's a story of a coup, and there's some truth to it, but it obscures, I think, a deeper truth, and the deeper truth is that the revolutionary elements of the Cultural Revolution weren't spread deep and wide amongst the masses, so that the masses themselves actually sided against the Gang of Four had the correct line. They were just carrying out incorrectly. I mean, people didn't like them in China. And so it was very easy to scapegoat them, even though they were correct in pointing out that, Deng Xiaoping was, the inheritor of Li Shaoqi's revisionism and all that stuff. They still were very easily scapegoated, and people didn't like them. So I think a large-scale revolutionary movement was lost, and I think Mao himself capitulated to the roaders at the end too, right? And that's, I'm a Maoist. I just say that just to say that that's the theory that arises from it. We're stuck with these names of people, but they're also ciphers of larger processes. And Maoism can also, just so we can, hold Marx to account as Marxist, we can hold, and Lenin to account as Leninist, we can hold Mao to account as Maoist as well.
And I think that's a really important point, because I think, and it's. I think it's a twofold problem, because, people outside of the communist, apparatus kind of see it in a way where it's like, oh, you call yourself a this, therefore, like, you think everything this guy said was like, the Bible, basically. But then, unfortunately, within the communist movement, sometimes there are people that also do the same thing, where it's like, oh, Lenin said X, Y, Z, therefore, today in 2017, this is exactly what we have to do in this exact way in any given situation. So I think, and in the book, you also talk about like the dogmatism that, we have to kind of combat within our movement. But then on the other spectrum of that, there's also like an eclecticism of like kind of anything goes, kind of liberal attitude towards like ideas and how they might impact the revolution. So I guess, to touch on that, like, how do you think we can deter like that kind of dogmatism from arising? I know it's a tough one.
I don't know. That's a hard one to say. I don't have any easy answers. I mean, just get involved with a group that's very critical of that kind of dogmatism, but isn't like have the other kind of dogmatism, which is just like, it is the side that always claims everything is dogmatic and sectarian tend to be very dogmatic and sectarian themselves, right? It's better to have kind of a just be involved with a group that fosters kind of this critical, like, what is the content of these ideas that the people are putting forward? How do we think through them critically, as opposed to just saying, oh, this person said that, let's just do this thing of quotes. And I think this happens a lot amongst I'm not going to say amongst communists as a whole, because I don't know communists as a whole, because there's like so many of them around the world, right? But people that right, doctrinaire Marxist-Leninists or even Marxist-Leninist Maoists that have some kind of internet platform like myself, and some of them will get into this because of their complete anger and rejection of, say, a bourgeois ideology. They tend up doing this thing about like, well, an argument is presented, they'll just quote Lenin, and that's their argument. It's like an argument from authority, right? Lenin said some great things, and we should quote, but we should also quote those within like understanding the historical argument and actually part of what I was doing with Continuity and Rupture, and the reason why I call it the philosophy of the Maoist terrain, was also trying to say what is the logical argument for making X claims about Maoism, not just because this person said it then and this person did this, but it's like, what is the historical argument in which they accrue? What can we say has universal validity for these reasons? How can we justify that, as opposed to saying, well, this person said that, right? And that person said that. And I think we do need to get away from that kind of thinking. It's very easy to do. And I think this society, though, encourages that kind of thinking. It does. Right? Like even, people who aren't communists and reactionaries will make arguments just by quoting some guy they like, right?
The biggest takeaways from this part of the discussion are that we have to veer away from a non-class struggle approach to history, and that people aren't perfect. On the first point, I'm sure that most of us learned history in a way where we look at great men writing decrees and laws that drastically changed the world. It makes sense that in a bourgeois or a capitalist and patriarchal world that we'd never be taught about seeing society more scientifically or from a class struggle, social relations kind of way. I think that capitalist society has very much inherited this type of view from its feudal imperial past. This abstract view of history is also very common in metaphysics and religion. Therefore, it's important when looking at the history of the Soviet Union, China, or anything else really, to look at the concrete struggles between classes and different groups of people and how that plays with the cultures and ideologies that move alongside it. For example, we can't understand racism in America without looking at the historical struggles between slaves, indentured servants, masters, etc., etc. The racist or incorrect ideas we may have about certain groups of people arise directly out of these concrete relations. On my second point, just because we're Marxists or Maoists, it doesn't mean that we think Marx or Mao are prophets or gods. I think that they were brilliant and wrote a lot of correct things that are still relevant and practical while still being critical of their mistakes. I also have to acknowledge that those individuals are also products of the social relations and historical development of their particular eras. For my next question, I asked JMP about the Communist Party of Peru, aka the Shining Path, and what role they had in formulating Marxism-Leninism-Maoism as a theory.
Yeah, the Communist Party of Peru, which gets known as the Sendero Luminoso or the Shining Path, I mean they are important for the history of understanding Marxism-Leninism-Maoism because of they're the first ones that claimed that Maoism was a third stage of revolutionary science, and that it should be called Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, and that was in 1988, I believe, and then they got involved with the Revolutionary Internationalist movement, which had all these other groups from Turkey, Nepal, India, Afghanistan, all over the place, and they put out a statement called "Long Live Marxism-Leninism-Maoism" in 1993, claiming it was the third stage. Now, I mean, at the time that was happening, the PCP was in its People's War in Peru, and it had reached this very high stage, it was a mass movement, and it was waging war against the Fujimori government, and but it kind of collapsed down at this point, and yeah, I think a number of reasons that it collapsed was stuff that Maoism tells us about that I think the Peruvians, in my opinion, didn't really follow through on. Like one was the personality cult stuff, right? Which is Maoist that we think, and I think the Indians have been really good with this. So have a lot of other ones. In fact, I think Ajith and the Indians one, he released a whole statement about how Maoism should reject the cults of personality, and even Mao, and even hold Mao and other people to account for allowing those to thrive. But the Peruvians upheld that everything that Gonzalo, that was Guzman, who was the main theoretician of the PCP, who put out really important stuff and led that movement. They had this idea that he that there's this Gonzalo thought, right? That he was this kind of great person, and they even had a name for it and all this kind of stuff. And what happened is that, I mean, I know I'm simplifying things here, but this is a podcast and there's a lot that goes into it. Yeah. There's a lot of debates about this, but the position I'm sympathetic to is that when he was arrested, in fact, the entire Central Committee was arrested. Yeah. They were caught in one place. They're all arrested, and they're put in. So the movement was beheaded, but unlike claims of people that say that, oh yeah, these party-led movements, once you get their leaders, they just fall apart, right? It's like, because it also had a theory of the mass line and stuff, they actually regenerated a new leadership really fast. And in fact, the People's War spread in that period with a new leadership. It wasn't just because they had a new Central Committee. Really, they had a whole method of how to do that. They had a whole mass line of how to do that. The problem was that the People's War intensified, it spread, and then a statement was released from prison from Guzman saying to stop and go into a peace process. And so it spread complete confusion, because this idea that he was like the great person means that there's people say, well, everything he says must be correct. And there were elements that were like, well, doesn't matter because we can't even trust if this is from him. It could be like conspiracy. There were other people that no, we know it's from him, and they had other reasons to do that. But it allowed the revisionist part of the movement to really latch onto it and say, Guzman said, the great Gonzalo said this, and and so it caused massive fissures and splits throughout the movement, and that's why it was defeated at the time. And it's moved into a pace where there's tons and tons of different PCP splinter groups that believe different things, from those that think it was Gonzalo and he was correct, so we lay down our arms, and then went into this kind of reformist kind of movement, to the ones that were it's a complete conspiracy, he would never say that, this is made up by the state. There's no way to know, right? But it's so it doesn't really matter, and a lot of those people are in exile, and they get really mad whenever you say he said that, because they're this is just this is a state conspiracy thing. It was invented. He never had anything to do with it.
No doubt.
And then there are those that think he did say it, but think that he's a traitor to the movement for that reason, and reject him completely and have and that. And I think it's also important to note, before this, there was a number of other errors that the PCP made in terms of the mass line. There were some violent activities, like excessive acts of violence in their attempt to deal with what they thought were collaborators, and a confusion of the state spread amongst things like that. So, I mean, that all needs to be critiqued as well. But beyond all that, the importance of them is that they held forward a people's war. They claimed there was a new stage of revolutionary science and followed through on it in a people's war right at the period of time when we were told that you couldn't have these kind of communist movements. And that it was the end of history, and then here's other people saying, no, there's a new stage of history starting. So, and what that inspired amongst different groups around the world is still really important.
So in terms of the Cultural Revolution, so we talked a little bit about, you said, there was some chaos and that it came in a little bit too late. What would you say were like some of the positive aspects? What did we learn from it in terms of like what potentially could happen in the future?
Well, again, and putting this forward, I'm my expertise is in philosophy and ideas and not history, although I do study history, so I'm not going to be the best on this, and there's a lot of other people that write things on this that are much better than me. And of course, history is a battleground, so you have bourgeois scholars, people that think they're socialist scholars writing other things versus like kind of revolutionary accounts. But I think, some of the stuff we can see from it at its height was that it did mobilize like every sector of the society to go out and get involved in political life, like everything, like people were producing art and ideas at every single level of society. It didn't matter. We could say some of the art looked cheesy or propagandistic, but it's like everyone was doing it. Like printing presses were open to everybody. There was like, wars of ideas. Like university university campuses had like multiple factions of people that would beat each other up over different ideas. Not that they should be beating each other up, but I mean the idea is that they all thought it was a revolution within the revolution. It was kind of, for the first time, I remember someone I spoke to once who had lived there and was there during the Cultural Revolution, and he was saying that it was like for the very first time, it's like it wasn't like it's like people at every sector of society were talking about communism. They weren't talking about socialism or something to get rid of like the feudal elements or the fact that their landlords were shitty or things like that. They were literally at all levels talking about making communism and becoming, they weren't using the term communist subjects, but they're basically talking about becoming the new communist human and all this kind of thing, right? What would that mean? Of course, there was so much debates around that and faction infighting around what would make it, but the idea that like society could open itself up under socialism and say, okay, we want everyone to think about building communism at every level of society. And that was shut down at a certain point of time, but kind of the creative potentials it unleashed is really important. I mean, like Dongping Han wrote this great book called The Unknown Cultural Revolution, right? Where he points out that everyone talks about the destruction that happened. I mean, because there was a lot of destruction, a lot of really dumb destruction of groups that were like everything from the past is bad. Let's smash it, and then the other factions tried to stop that, and it's like it's like this is what happens when the masses energy are unleashed, right? They just get like really excited about stuff. But there was also the fact that Dongping Han points out that people don't talk about the creative building that the amount of like hospitals and schools that were built at that time, and an infrastructure that was built in the midst of this so-called chaos, where like student work teams would go down and work in the countryside building stuff. And a lot of them were sent down, forced to go down, and now they're all bitter about it. But it was like, but the idea was like, well, why should you be bitter about going down to like where all these poor people are that that we're still trying to like change life and make all of society socialist. There was still a lot of other people that were doing that necessarily and thought it was like this really great thing to do. So those are some of the things that I think were unleashed there. I mean, another one I liked, Mobo Gao's book on the battle for China's past. He kind of talks about how like you do these kind of traveling museum shows of the Cultural Revolution, which show everything there. He was like, kind of like, you can find that almost everything at that time, even if it was like a kitchen utensil, was stamped with political propaganda, just made by some guy making spoons, was I'm going to put like a slogan on my spoon, right? And it's like, and it was just this idea that ideas were stamping every object in society, which shows just how vital ideology was at that period of time.
Definitely, yeah. And also, like the whole thing with like the big character posters where like people would criticize the local authority, or even teachers and things like that. And I found the one part I found really interesting was how even like students could criticize their teachers. And then even in some cases where if maybe one student was like taking advantage of the fact that he could do that, and basically, would just be disrupting the class, but then the other students would like turn against him and be like, hey, like you can't be doing this because we're here to learn, and how like that would, but there was like just like it seemed like overall there was a lot of potential for like what can happen in a society in terms of like political involvement, like you said, at every level of the society, which is like something we clearly don't have under capitalism, right? Where it's like most people are kind of, just go about your daily life and then you wait every 4 years to maybe vote. And even the involvement that people have in that isn't even that high, especially today versus what it was in like, I don't know, the 70s or 60s or something like that, in terms of voter turnout. So I think the potential there is definitely something that we can learn a lot from, even just being involved in this kind of work or activity. So I wanted to ask you, this is a bit of kind of a sidetrack, but in terms of, I just wanted to ask you, like, who do you think who are some of your favorite like authors or theorizers, whether within the communist movement or outside of it? I'm sure there's a long list.
That's a really that's the problem when you're a reader and an academic, you just have too many people on that list. I mean, so this would be like not counting the classics, like with the Marxist classics aside. All those I should just do my like, oh yeah, they're the best, right? And like that, Marx, Lenin, Luxemburg, Mao, all that kind of stuff. Not Trotsky, that kind of stuff. But if you think about kind of people in contemporary times or times since then, I mean, I definitely think Gramsci is really important, just for political philosophy, and a lot of that has to do with my advisor for my doctorate was a Gramscian, and he was a Gramsci authority. So a lot of his approaches to his Gramscian approaches to things kind of creep down into the way I understood the world, even though I wasn't writing expressly on Gramsci. And I think Althusser is good. I mean, he gets, there's a lot of problems with Althusser, and I'll be the first to admit I used to hate Althusser for a long time, mainly just because I was taught Marxism every time I learned from Marxism from my undergrad or outside in political organizing circles or in my MA, or it was always like people that were not fans of Althusser, so they presented a certain way of understanding him, and also there's all his other problems of rejecting his students in '68, the fact that he murdered his wife.
Oh boy, I didn't even know about that. Yeah.
Serious mental illness. And so, but as a philosopher, I think his work in philosophy as a Marxist was very useful for me to think through some things, even though I reject a lot of his ideas. I feel the way he engaged as a philosopher with Marxist theory, he understood the distinction between philosophy and theory was something that, and between philosophy and science as well is something that that has taught me a lot to think clearly about what I mean when I'm doing philosophy as a Marxist. And I think, a lot of post-Althusserians then kind of fall into that. I have this, even though I think Badiou is a post-Maoist now, and I think he's needlessly obscurantist so many times, right? I respect a lot of the work he's done and some of the stuff you could see it in Continuity and Rupture, some stuff that I would pull out of Badiou to help explain things. So I like, his work. I'm trying to think of who now is a contemporary. I think one of the people I really liked recently that I discovered was Robert Beale, who
I'm not aware of his.
Yeah, he wrote this book called The Entropy of Capitalism. One of the most interesting works thorough works I've seen that talks about the ecology and connects it to the crisis and everything like that. And he also wrote way back when he was part of an anti-revisionist organization in the UK. He wrote in the 80s, as part of that group, Eurocentrism and the communist movement, which was actually the first case of Eurocentrism being used, and predated Samir Amin's work. And that's the other name I'd say too. Is Amin, I have a long love with Samir Amin's work as a radical political economist, and I still think Class and Nation is one of the classics of the 1980s that deserves to be republished and hasn't been for a long time. Needs a second edition, and there's so many more, right? I'm just trying to think of like who I could say, right? I mean, there's more even within the movement text. Like, you think about people like Anurata Gandhi's work, and who died recently, and her work on proletarian feminism and the caste question in India is very vital.
I was interested in your thoughts on like how do we, because I find that there are still a lot of, at least from what I've seen, Marxist-Leninists that still consider modern day China to be socialist, and I was wondering how we should conceptualize that, or like how do we make that analysis to say no, it's not. Like how do we? I know it's a big question.
It is, it's a big one, and I'm not gonna. I could go in forever, and then everything I say, like someone that actually believes that market socialism is socialism. I think we could do two things. First of all, we have to be very clear that, like, China. I mean, there's a lot of xenophobia about China as well, that it lingers over from Cold War propaganda, where you have like the Americans say certain things about how evil China is or something like that. I mean, very clearly Eurocentric, racist kind of notions of that, and that sometimes amongst, like, say, left communists who think every actually existing socialism that has ever existed in history isn't real socialism, and this idea of true socialism, they fall into that kind of depictions of China as well in the same way, but they'll say that it was like that from the beginning and there's no rupture. I think those of us in the Maoist camp, we have a very clear historical story. We understand there was a struggle in the Cultural Revolution, and the forces under Mao failed. And the people that won followed a productive forces analogy and are the capitalist roaders. And that, despite the fact that the Gang of Four may not have been leading the revolutionary movement, were scapegoated, their analysis of those people was correct, right? Those were the capitalist roaders. And, there was, one of the early kind of anti-revisionist texts that was written by the China Study Group, I think, in the 70s, this text called like the capitalist roaders are still in the capitalist road. So they wrote around that kind of time, and I think that analysis is correct. And you just have to look at like people that have done serious like class analysis and social investigation in China that like lived there, like Min-Chi Lee, who is kind of I could say more of a definitely a communist and kind of more towards like a Maoist interpretation of things. Definitely Mao Zedong thought interpretation. He lived through a lot of struggles. He associated at one point of time with a very liberal view of society, and then in the Tiananmen Square stuff, he ended up being, oh man, all the students I'm with have these really bad views, whereas in these workers that are pulling out pictures of Mao that I'm in prison with, they seem to know what's going on. So it kind of that radicalized him into understanding China and why is it that the peasants and workers were demanding a return to the Cultural Revolution. And so he wrote a book called like The Study of Classes in Modern China. I think that's the name, but it's where he breaks down to show that there is a bourgeois and stuff. It is state capitalism, and he did a good analysis of how that functions. So I think those studies are ones that do show that, and I think a lot of the people that just want to say because they want to reject American imperialism and things like that, but who want to say that there's no capitalism in China aren't reading these studies or taking them very, very seriously.
So there you have my interview with author and professor of philosophy J. Moufawad-Paul. If you want to find his works, you can go to his website, moufawad-paul.blogspot.ca. That's moufawad-paul.blogspot.ca. You can also Google MLM Mayhem to find his website. I'll leave a link to his website wherever this episode gets posted. He has a handful of books, and this particular episode focused on his book Continuity and Rupture, Philosophy in the Maoist Terrain. We only touched on as much as we could in about an hour, so I would suggest checking out his works and future episodes of En Masse if you want to go even more in depth. To summarize what we talked about, I think it's crucial that socialists and communists that are serious about revolution remain critical when discussing any current or historical events. We have to be critical of the capitalistic system we want to put to rest, but also critical of our own actions as communist or socialist revolutionaries. Failing to do this would be shooting ourselves in the foot given how huge of a task we are attempting to attain. I am a great admirer of what the Soviet Union was able to achieve during its existence, and this also applies to China during the revolutionary era, but I'll also be the first to point out the mistakes that the communist parties made back then that led to revisionist errors and the capitalism that followed. Even though the capitalist world and the West overstate and exaggerate the quote-unquote failures of socialism and communism in order to pacify workers and the oppressed away from revolution, we can't pretend as if our favorite communist leaders and parties never made errors. especially errors that involved communists organizing society like bourgeois capitalists do, which in turn leads to more capitalism. This is no easy task, but one that we're challenged with if we're serious about superseding exploitation and removing the dictatorship of the capitalists over the working class. To stay updated with En Masse, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud, Patreon, and also Podbean. All you have to do is search En Masse Podcast, and you should be able to find it. My name is Mubarak, and see you next time on En Masse.